Well, welcome. We will give it just a moment here before we get started. Let people join in. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the June WSA Learning Session. This is a caregiver experience trends in healthcare. Just a few housekeeping tips as we get started. All the participants are placed on mute for the presentation. If you have questions for Lisa, please include them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of the presentation or as we're going through. We do want the questions. Please share your questions. We are recording this session and we'll be sending it out to all attendees within 48 hours following the session here. Now, let me introduce Lisa Wager, Executive Consultant at WSA. Lisa has a number of years of experience in strategic workforce planning and operational excellence. She excels in helping businesses achieve sustainable growth, maintain a competitive edge, and navigate complex workforce challenges. We're excited to hear her insights today. Welcome, Lisa. Take it away.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you so much. And hello, I'm so glad you've all joined. I'm super excited and quite honestly, frankly, am privileged to be presenting WSA's June Learning focused on healthcare. I've just, as Randy had said, I've been working, for clients in this industry for well over a decade. So while all industries, of course, are important, this one really stands out in that it impacts each and every one of us when we think about it at some of our best times and even potentially some of the toughest times in our lives. So whether we're patients, family members, or just part of the community, this workforce that we're going to be talking about today, they offer life-saving solutions, care, and comfort when we need it most. So happy that you all can join, and I'm really excited to share what we have here. So first off, we will talk about, obviously how we can impact that caregiver experience. We'll talk about the trends that we've seen. This workforce has been through so much. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looked like and what it looks like today and some of the hot topics that they're dealing with. And then just really diving into understanding how do we engage these caregivers? How do we make sure we're retaining our best talent? So based upon the research that we've pulled together, throughout the course of several years, we are able to isolate some of those key components. And then, of course, I want to leave you with some real tangible actions that I know will make a difference in creating a positive caregiver experience. So first and foremost, let's look at what this journey has been for our healthcare workers over the course of the past several years. So we know that, and we all experienced that the pandemic was quite difficult. As we look at the different industries, each and every one have taken on some different issues. But when we think about healthcare, they really took on the brunt of everything related to the pandemic. And these are things that we already know, of course. But just as you can see, as we look at these benchmarks, these trends related to engagement, as well as employees' intention to stay within healthcare, you can see during 2020, 2021, just during the height of the pandemic, we see those numbers plummet, particularly in 2020. What I find really interesting about these trends in 2020 is that engagement, it's holding up. It's not at that normal level of 78, but it's holding up at a 75%, meaning 3/4 of the workforce is still engaged despite going through some of these hard times, these issues. But we look at their intention to stay just plummeting by about 9 points. So what that tells me is that, hey, they're there, they signed up for this, they're in it, but this burnout is really taking a toll. As we move past the pandemic, you can see that again, we see a recovery in 2022. So the hopefulness of, things getting back to normal, we're able to operate a little bit better. But very notably in 2023, this comes down again. So we'll talk a bit about why that might be as we're looking at different challenges that are affecting this workforce, namely, budget constraints, patient care, safety, those sorts of things, as well as we know staffing shortages and burnout. So looking at some of those hot topics within healthcare, first and foremost, patient care quality and accessibility. So this is a big topic. Of course, that is the main purpose of why people latch onto these careers as caregivers. They want to make sure that they're giving the best to their patients. But again, given the different budget constraints, we're dealing with a different economy now. Healthcare doesn't have what they used to have in some instances. And because of that, they're building in efficiencies. They're working with lean staff. They are, taking on things that they hadn't already, and they're trying to measure these sorts of things. So given all of those kind of operational pieces, those changes that are taking place, this is sometimes that workload is taking on a little bit more. It's contributing to burnout, but it's also contributing to our caregivers' views of, hey, are leaders focused on patient care, or are they focused on the budget and the bottom line? We'll talk a little bit more about that because that is a big deal. And of course, as I had mentioned, burnout, wellness, this is a known, this is an obvious, and they've been dealing with this for the last several years. So, hitting on those key points and understanding how organizations, how these health systems can really help to combat that burnout. And of course, the staffing shortages, and not just the staffing shortages, but talent shortages, is getting people into the spots that have the education, that have the training that they need. And once they're there, making sure that we're doing the right things to retain them. So as we talk about burnout, as we talk about these efficiencies and staffing shortages, of course, if you're coming in and you're trying to give it your all, we need to make sure that all the roadblocks are removed, having the resources, having the right training for our employees. And again, we went through some times within the pandemic, but even now, some of those barriers are still in place. And then, of course, safety, whether we're talking physical safety, patient safety, as well as psychological safety for all. And that contributes to, and actually all of these things contribute to potential unionization. This is something within our caregiver group that has come up as some risks, where we're looking at some pockets of organization where we want to get ahead of that and make sure that we aren't in a position and we can rectify and be proactive about things before these different caregivers get to that point. So those being those hot topics. So as we look to, not only understanding the state of things, but understanding what are the things that we can do as health systems, as organizations, as leaders and managers to really help to elevate and create that positive caregiver experience. And as we look through our research, as we look through the data, we first and foremost found that common with all healthcare employees are some key drivers that came up to the forefront. And first and foremost, vision. So employees, all healthcare employees, want to know, are we headed in the right direction? Do I have confidence that we are stable, we're focused, and we know that purpose that we're headed in and we can achieve it? And also, what is my role in all of that? Hand in hand with that is trusting our leaders to make the right decisions, do the right things, and care about us in the meantime. And then another additional point that we found as far as what was driving engagement for all of our healthcare employees were making sure that their voice matters, their ideas, suggestions are solicited and also valued. So those being some common themes throughout healthcare, but we know caregivers, they also have their unique points that they're looking for above and beyond all the healthcare system. What is unique for our caregivers, above and beyond the vision, the trust in leaders, and making sure that their ideas and suggestions are valued, is, you can guess, that work-life balance. So this ties right back into what we talked about, the burnout. So making sure that work-life balance is in place and there's a way to support that. And as I mentioned, resources and skills training. This is a huge barrier, again, where it comes to making sure that we have what we need to do the work, that we are able to get things done and mitigate burnout within a timely manner. Commitment to patient care, as I had mentioned, this is at the forefront. This is that purpose in terms of why they're coming to work every day, but there may be a disconnect, and we'll explore that a little bit further. And then additional unique to caregivers is essentially feeling valued and making sure that they have fair compensation. We'll talk about each and every one of these a little bit further, but One thing to start off with here is that commitment to patient care, and this is directly tied to their trust in leaders. So looking a little bit more under the hood here, what you're looking at is, we'll focus on this first key and foremost component as it relates to not just all healthcare workers, but our caregivers, vision, mission, and purpose, as well as trust in leaders. As you can see, there is a bit of a distinct difference between our healthcare workers overall compared to our caregivers. But as we know, this is something that's driving engagement for our caregivers as well as healthcare workers. What they're looking for is that confidence in where we're going, the alignment to the purpose, because again, with that old adage of all things being equal, people would rather work for a purpose than a paycheck. This is most applicable with our caregivers and why they joined this type of industry in the first place. And of course, making sure that they understand what is their role, how can they contribute to that purpose. So this gives us that roadmap in terms of ways in which we as an organization, as a health system, can help to reinforce that sense of purpose. But as I had mentioned, there is this disconnection between our leaders and what we're hearing from them and what we're seeing compared to what we want. So as we look at that trust in leaders at this company, we're seeing that there's a 10-point difference in that trust level between just normal healthcare employees compared to caregivers. So with that, and notably, less than half are reporting that they do trust their leaders. So with this, it's important that not only are we talking about the direction we're headed and why, but also making sure that communication is consistent, making sure that actions are seen from our leaders, and making sure that we're showing that we can care and support them. Again, going back to a lot of what we see within even our qualitative data, a lot of times saying, hey, we're focusing in on these metrics, we're focusing in on my paperwork at the end of the day, the documentation. Those are all very important, but there's a disconnect between caregivers understanding why it's so important and how it relates back to that purpose. So just a quick point, as I had mentioned, never lose sight of that purpose, being able to reinforce, share, recognize how each person plays a role. That is an injection of fuel. That is, it certainly will resonate with this group that was attracted to this field in the first place. Another driver that we found was related to feeling valued and being heard. Feeling as though you're a valued contributor. This stems above and beyond just giving out the recognition, giving out the formal rewards. It really, truly comes down to not just recognizing, but appreciating your workforce, making sure that their ideas are solicited, their suggestions are important, and getting them involved in patient care in some of those decisions. So it's reinforcing that the work that they do is important, as well as their contributions. And as controversial as it may be, or I should say being paid fairly and appropriately for the work that they do, came up as a key driver of engagement. So I want to stop here for a second because it's pretty important to make this distinction. This is not about pay. This is about the fairness in that compensation. So it's about thinking or knowing that I'm being as fairly paid for the work that I do that others. So I think back to, again, when we needed the traveling nurses, and in some systems, we're still needing those traveling nurses, and they're getting paid an exponentially more amount of money than our typical workforce. That's just one example of how our caregivers might be feeling as though there's a disconnect or a lack of equity in terms of how they're being paid. It also comes down to how they're feeling valued. So again, not about the pay, but more about the fairness in terms of how they are getting paid appropriately for that important work. And one little important point that we found as part of this data, this research, one of the key components in terms of retaining our caregivers was related to autonomy and their involvement in making decisions related to patient care. Again, this is critical because it's giving their voice and their ideas, their expertise and their skills and their education, some sort of value that goes above and beyond just doing the day-to-day work and the day-to-day care. And in this instance, only 66% feel that they are empowered to do so. Next, of course, you knew this was coming. We'll talk about balance, burnout, and support. This is key to engaging our workforce. So as we think about engagement, as you can see, as we look at the differences between our healthcare overall compared to our caregivers, there is, again, a distinct difference as we would expect. But in this instance, we're seeing some sort of a discrepancy here in terms of that balance and burnout. So important to note as we talk about and ask about the amount of stress in their job, if it's manageable or not, we have a little over 50%, a little over half saying yes, it is manageable. But strikingly, a fourth, 26% are clearly stating that they're not able to manage that stress. So big point here, but they are saying 75% say that their managers do care about supporting them and are providing some support, but this burnout is stemming above and beyond that and may go back to some of those operational pieces. And when we think about the job, just the basics of what we can do to eliminate barriers, eliminate frustrations, it's about resources, it's about training. So how can we make sure that they have what they need to do the work, that there is appropriate staff involved, and that they have all of the training that they need to take on to do their job appropriately and feel good about what they're doing at the end of the day. And one thing to note here, again, going back to retention, work-life balance was the #1 predictor of why caregivers consider leaving their company, leaving the health system, and leaving the field. So again, can't emphasize this enough. If we can take care of some of those operational pieces, such as the resources and the training, we also can focus on the wellness components, such as the support, the listening, and wellness programs. Now, one thing, thinking about retention, is considerably striking as we reviewed the research here. When we looked at tenure, and as you can see, typical engagement tenure is what we would expect, this U-shape. You join the organization, you feel that honeymoon effect, it drops off a little bit, but it tends to come back up as we spend more time with the organization. But as you can see, our generational patterns are not consistent with what we've seen previously. In fact, our younger generation is actually dropping at much higher rates than the older. So looking at our Gen Z within that orange line, you can see here that there is an 18-point drop from the time that they join their organization to the time that they leave within that year. That's striking, and it's actually alarming. And in fact, another thing to add on to that is within the first 3 months, there's a 10-point drop. So this really shows that there is an extreme risk for turnover for those younger generations, because what we're seeing is not only is it work-life balance, but they're coming in with a different set of expectations, particularly after everything related to the pandemic, how I'm working, where I'm working, what does that arrangement look like, the flexibility, as well as that work-life balance. So, of course, this plays into some real critical implications as we think about how do we recruit that next generation? How do we make sure that we're getting that talented, educated group that's coming in the door? How do we retain them as well? So staffing shortages aside, that being one issue, how do we then in turn make sure that we are getting this next generation onboarded, engaged, and continuing to engage them so that they stay for the long course of time? One other thing that I mentioned earlier, we can tie safety back to just about everything within healthcare. So employee safety at work, it's not just about the patient safety and of course, the psychological safety, but in this instance, we're really talking about my safety. When I come to work, how do I feel? And as you can see here, for the most part, both healthcare and caregivers feel as though they are generally safe when they come to work. And when we think about psychological safety, they feel that they can discuss work hazards. So that comfort level, that safety level is there. But the biggest distinction here is that caregivers, as compared to overall healthcare, they are significantly different. So there's a 17-point difference between everybody else within the health system compared to our caregivers coming into work. And even though there's this, again, that disconnect between what is the organization doing to commit to my safety, to our overall employee safety, this is a big point here, because not only does it play into how they see safety moving forward, safety for their coworkers, but we know that safety is a key point, a key risk for unionization. It is, in fact, one of the key validated factors that are related to predicting labor unionization. So keeping that in mind and knowing that is one of the hot topics for a lot of systems here, we want to make sure that we are able to close that gap, and for our caregivers, get as close to 100% as we can in terms of safety itself. Now, like I said, I want to leave you with some real tangible things here, things that we can do, just really focusing in on those themes that we talked about. But I also just want to step back for a second and talk about the why. Why are we focusing in on these key drivers of engagement? Why are we talking about caregiver experience? One thing that I probably should have brought up at the fore point of this is that we know that engaged workers, engaged caregivers, they work harder, they care more, they stay longer. And because of that, we can tie it back to patient care, patient experience, safety, of course, the health of our patients and so forth. So it's important. It's so important. So, I've been looking at these numbers for years, but for me, these really came to life last year when I spent about 2 weeks in the hospital with a family loved one. And in that time, I directly witnessed, and I also felt the impact. I saw the outstanding care. I saw the patient and the family being affected by these caregivers. And I personally built relationships with some of those caregivers over the course of time. So really emphasizing that I could tell the difference between those that were engaged versus those that weren't, and having looked at this data and understood the importance of it year over year, actually seeing it and feeling it was just confirming of all that we do here. So this is what makes actions all the more important. So everything that I've shown you today, they are direct drivers of that very engagement that makes a difference. So this helps us to prioritize. Everything that we've talked about here helps us to prioritize what are some of those actions that we can take. And everybody has a role. So as we talk about leaders, leaders communicate, making sure they're communicating that vision, they're reinforcing the purpose, revalidating why they joined this field in the first place, and making sure that we're sharing what does that progress look like. Leaders should be sharing the success stories, highlighting teams that have really made an impact, showing them that their job, regardless of what it is, it matters, it makes the difference. And then showing employees that you care. There's a lot of talk. I think leaders are more out there than they have been with rounding. But I will caveat this, making sure you're rounding with encouragement, with conversation, with getting to know people versus the critical eye, the punitive perspective. So making sure that rounding is coming from an understanding, an awareness, and a humanistic perspective, and then making sure you're supporting wellness and investing into staffing and resources. For managers, managers are there to really cascade that vision, the communications, reinforcing our goals, our unit's goals, and how we can achieve them. The manager can directly influence that experience by recognizing and appreciating each and every person's effort, but also taking the time to listen, get those ideas, get them involved in patient care. And when it comes to burnout, making sure that we are encouraging our employees to take advantage. Number one, know that where the wellness resources are, please take advantage of those resources, encourage them to take time off, whatever it might be, and then also removing the barriers that might get in the way of getting the work done, as well as investing into their training and their development. And it is important that, again, everybody has a role here. Each and every caregiver has actions to take too. So they are responsible for making sure that they're looking into those wellness resources and taking advantage of those assets, prioritizing their self-care. gaining a group, seeking guidance from peers, mentors, managers, peer groups, support groups, and then most notably supporting their colleagues, helping to create a positive work environment will certainly help with that notion of burnout. So just a couple general actions that can be taken, but of course these can be built upon and built out even further. So hopefully that was insightful and educational for all. Any questions? And I will check the chat in the meantime. All right, well, if there are no questions, well, I might have one. Oh, there's Randy.
Hey, Lisa. I'll ask a couple questions of you that I was thinking about. Thank you for your session. Fantastic. Can you talk any changes that you've seen in like routines and surveying, maybe in the frequencies or the things that they're measuring?
Yes. In fact, I'd say that it's ramped up a bit more in terms of the cadence of surveys. And that might be a direct effect from, with the pandemic. I think we saw just a slowdown, sluggish surveys when really they should have been surveying just to make sure that we had a tap or a read. But are seeing that kind of ramped up a little bit more. A lot of the organizations that I work, they're still on that annual cadence of an annual survey, but we'll inject some pockets of pulses just to focus in on some key areas that maybe they've been acting upon. As far as what I've seen measured probably more frequently than I have in the past is a lot of union vulnerability components. So that, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and obviously wellness, have become more prominent in our measures.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Anything else?
No, I think that's it. And well, I thank you all for joining.
You bet. Thanks, Lisa. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.